Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. If you're winding down for the night, let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in the comments below. We love knowing who's drifting off across the world, okay? And if you enjoy slow, immersive history told just like this, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Asterisk. It starts in whispers. A story older than most cities. A myth wrapped in royal linen and smuggled out of the halls of a palace like contraband. But long before poets turned it into song, there was a real place, a real woman, and real men who turned the question of her chastity into the justification for bloodshed that would last a decade. The city was Sparta, nestled not just in legend, but in the ironclad culture of honor. Spartan men were forged for war, but Spartan women, they were raised for reputation. From childhood, girls were taught to command their households with strength, to speak boldly, and to bear sons for the state. Yet even in such a society, the purity of a queen could ignite international ruin. Her name was Helen, born of Leda, and, if you believed the stories of Swan, or God, or both, what matters is not what she truly was, but what she came to symbolize. The perfect woman, the most beautiful, a prize, a vessel, a reason. But Helen was not just beautiful, she was politically priceless. Her marriage to Menelaus, younger brother of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was a matter of diplomacy as much as desire. The union tied Sparta to the most powerful house in mainland Greece, a bond both strategic and delicate. Helen became queen. She bore a daughter. She presided over court life with a still ceremonial grace, and, for a while, all was quiet. Then came Paris, not a soldier, not a king, a guest, Trojan prince on a diplomatic visit, or, some say, a man on a divine errand. The gods were always part of this tale. They bickered and bet over mortal beauty. They promised him the love of the fairest woman on earth, and Paris, who had never known Helen, made a choice that would haunt cities. Whether he seduced her or stole her remains unclear, and perhaps that is the point. The ambiguity of consent. In a world that rarely granted women the right to declare it, some versions of the story say she loved him. Others say she was taken by force. In both retellings, Helen ends up on a ship sailing east toward the towers of Troy, and, in both versions, it is her chastity that becomes the problem. Menelaus claimed dishonor, his household violated, his pride defiled or stolen. The terms vary depending on the poet, but the conclusion was fixed. Her absence meant war. The mere idea that another man had touched what was his maid, war inevitable. And so, Greece mobilized. One woman's purity, real, imagined, corrupted, or preserved, became the rallying cry of 1,000 ships. Memnon, thirsty for glory, used the outrage as leverage. Odysseus, clever and reluctant, was tricked into joining. Achilles, still young, still mortal, was promised greatness, and all of them kings, generals, brothers, marched, not because they missed Helen, because her story gave them a reason, an excuse, pretext. Helen, meanwhile, disappears into silence. In the earliest accounts, she does not protest. She does not write letters home. She does not call for peace. Instead, she becomes a figurehead, neither woman nor witness, but a symbol. Her role in the war was not to act, but to be talked about. Back in Greece, the question of her honor echoed louder than her voice ever could. Was she faithful? Was she tricked? Was she complicit? Men fought not for her, but over what she represented. An empire's shame, a family's pride, man's wounded ownership. As cities burned, Helen's name became both banner and curse. And yet, few paused to ask what she actually wanted. The Greeks landed on Trojan shores. The siege began. And Helen, behind high walls, was once again reduced to story. But was she truly there by choice? And how did her life unfold while thousands died in her name? Asterisk, the war surged on for years. 10, according to Homer. Fewer, perhaps, in reality. But time was less important than the idea. The long, drawn-out struggle to reclaim honor as defined by a woman's body. And behind it all, as Helen waited, Troy was not some dusty ruin at the edge of myth. It was a real place, a thriving Bronze Age city near the Dardanelles in what is now modern-day Turkey. It sat on a crucial trade route between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Its wealth came from ships. Its power came from gold, horses, and walls thick enough to repel nearly anything the Greeks hurled at them. The people of Troy were not barbarians. They were traders, artisans, priests, and, for a time, they were hosts. Helen was given a room in the palace, possibly her own quarters. She was treated, according to the legends, with respect, even reverence. But what does reverence feel like when it's soaked in political calculation? Paris, her supposed lover, was not the most powerful man in the city. His father, King Priam, ruled with age and caution. His brother, Hector, led the armies, a disciplined commander with no time for romantic indulgences. The city could not afford scandal, and yet here they were, sheltering a foreign woman whose face had stirred an armada. And still, Helen remained. Was she watched? Certainly. Was she confined? It's likely. But was she a prisoner? Or was she simply stuck inside the consequences of myth? What we do know is that Troy did not send her back. Some believe Priam tried to, that the Trojans offered restitution, but the Greeks refused it, not because they wanted Helen, but because they wanted war. Others say Paris refused, citing love or pride or some divine promise. The poets preferred to say that Helen stayed willingly. It made for better drama. But better drama rarely means better history. Some later historians, like Herodotus, doubted the entire story. Qui suggested Helen had never been in Troy at all, but instead ended up in Egypt during the war. According to this version, the Greeks and Trojans fought for a phantom, a mistaken assumption, a myth spiraling into massacre. Still, the official version persisted. Inside Troy, Helen became a ghost in silk. She moved through corridors where eyes followed her, not with admiration, but calculation. What was she thinking? What was she waiting for? Homer gives her a voice only once a moment on the walls of Troy, looking out at the Greek soldiers below. She points them out by name. She names the kings. She remembers their faces. It's not clear whether this was longing, regret, or something. Colder, a detached observation of the men who'd burned the world in her name. She speaks with Priam. They talk of family, loss, and in that moment, for just a brief stanza, Helen becomes human again, but only for a moment. The war continues. Men rot in tents. Children grow up in the shadow of spears. Troy's fields are burned and salted, and the city holds, year after year, while Helen's name echoes in war councils. Achilles kills Hector. Paris kills Achilles. The gods interfere and retreat. The war grows stale, a kind of tired death rhythm. And still, nobody fetches Helen, no rescue mission, no negotiation. The Greeks seem more concerned with plunder and power than the actual return of their queen. And perhaps that was always the point in most versions, okay? It is not until the end, when Odysseus conceives the wooden horse, that Helen's name reemerges as more than a banner. Some claim she helped the Greeks, that she feigned loyalty to Troy, but gave away secrets. Others say she tried to trick the Greeks, calling out in the voices of their wives from inside the horse to expose them. Still others suggest she was silent, once again watching from a high room as the city prepared to sleep for the last time when Troy fell. The city was not simply defeated, it was erased. Women were taken as slaves. Children were thrown from towers. Fires gutted temples, and, in the ash of all that, Helen was recovered, but not punished. Menelaus found her, and by some accounts, raised his sword to kill her on the spot. Yet the moment he saw her, he faltered. Perhaps she disrobed. Perhaps she cried. Perhaps, most simply, she was still beautiful. And Menelaus, who had started the war in her name, brought her home. No trial, no exile, no confession. Just a ship, a return, and a quiet reinstallation as Queen of Sparta. But what did Helen think, stepping off that boat? What does it mean to be blamed for a war you didn't start, or perhaps did, and to be forgiven, not because you were innocent, but because you were useful? Back in Sparta, Helen lived out her days in a haze of forgetfulness. She became a mother again, queen again, a symbol, still this time of restoration. Some later accounts say she died peacefully. Others say she was cast out by her daughter, bitter from the war. Still, others claim she ascended to Olympus, the gods reclaiming their instrument. What remains is not Helen's will, but her legacy. Used to start a war, used to end it. In the middle, forgotten dot. Was she ever more than a metaphor? Helen returned to Sparta. The ships that had burned and slaughtered in her name were gone. The husbands, sons, and brothers who had not survived, they, too, were gone. But she remained, and that fact alone made her the most dangerous kind. A figure in history. Not a myth, not a martyr, not even a villain, but something worse. An unresolved story in the centuries that followed the fall of Troy. Whether that city fell, in fact, or just in fable, Helen became whatever each era needed her to be dot to the Athenians of the classical age. She was a cautionary tale. To the tragedians, she was the embodiment of dangerous beauty. To the Spartans, perhaps, she was a symbol of forgiveness or complicity. Or maybe just something to be forgotten. A delicate, polished statue no one wanted to knock over again. Her image was repurposed endlessly. Painters depicted her disrobing at Menelaus' feet. Playwrights debated her guilt. Philosophers, like Gorgias, even wrote speeches defending her, arguing that persuasion, not passion, had enslaved her, that if she was taken, it was not by lust or by force, but by language. In other words, Helen had no agency, and that, ironically, was the defense. It is the strangest thing about historical narratives built around a woman's purity. Her own words, patience, and choices are rarely the center of the tale. Instead, she becomes a cipher, a justification, a symbol of national insult, masculine pride, or divine drama. And that, perhaps, is where Helen's true historical role lives. Not in whether she loved Paris or betrayed Menelaus, but in what her story allowed men to do. The war that followed. Her name was not really about her. It was about power. Power disguised as vengeance. Power dressed up in honor. Power made palatable by a narrative that said, "This woman was taken, and that cannot stand." But what does it mean when societies are so fragile, so steeped in pride, that one woman's perceived transgression can send fleets to sea? Helen became the prototype. Her story echoed forward into other eras, other wars, other women. Think of Lucretia in Rome. Think of Inés de Castro in Portugal. Think of every woman whose body was turned into a symbol of land, loyalty, or law. In many cases, the question of their purity was never answered because it never needed to be. It was the accusation that mattered. It was the idea that a nation, a king, a people had been violated and that only blood could cleanse the stain. As for Helen, later Greek writers struggled to reconcile her beauty with her supposed betrayal. Some made her a goddess, others a demon. Euripides even wrote a play where she was never in Troy at all, merely an illusion sent by the gods, while the real Helen waited in Egypt. A neat trick that it allowed Greece to fight its war with dignity intact. 'Cause if the real Helen had never gone to Troy, then no Greek hero had truly been cuckolded. No shame, no stain, only glory. But that version too was fiction. A fiction designed not to free Helen, but to rescue men from the implications of their own story. We're left, then, with the woman herself, an enigma, a vessel, maybe a survivor. Did she mourn the thousands who died? Did she weep for Hector? Did she ever walk outside, away from the palaces, the myths, and the poets, and let the Aegean wind touch her skin without thinking of the flames it carried from Troy? We will never know. Helen remained silent, but her story echoes because history often needs someone to blame. And when that blame must be simple, poetic, and unforgettable, it often lands on a woman. A woman whose chastity, once questioned, becomes a cause. But what does that say about the men who needed her to fall? So what does it say about the cities that rose and fell based on what she did or did not allow? What does it say about us, still retelling her tale thousands of years later and still unsure what she wanted? We've ended the first story in our journey through history's quiet absurdities. But this is only the beginning. Asterisk, Rome, before the Senate, before the Republic, before emperors and eagles and roads that led to everywhere. It was a monarchy, a city ruled by kings, bound more by legend than law, and held together with fear, wealth, and ritual. At its peak stood Lucius Tarquinius Superbus Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome, a man whose name would one day be spoken with disgust. But in his time, he ruled with ambition, ruthless, absolute. His court glittered with violence and vanity. His sons roamed like princes without consequences, and into this world stepped Lucretia. She was not a queen, not a warrior, just a Roman noblewoman, the wife of a respected commander, Collatinus, known more for his honor than his power. She lived in a villa near Calatia, outside Rome's city center, removed, serene, and, by all accounts, dutiful. Lucretia's beauty was not scandalous. It was her virtue people spoke of endlessly, admiringly, like a piece of polished stone, chaste, modest, devoted, a woman who spun wool while others drank wine, a woman whose very name came to mean moral perfection. And that, as always in these stories, was the problem, because the more she was praised for her purity, the more her virtue became a target. One night, a group of Roman men, including her husband, Collatinus, and Tarquin's son, Sextus, were drinking, boasting, comparing the virtues of their wives. It was a common pastime, men staking claims through the imagined perfection of the women they married. Collatinus spoke with calm pride. Others bragged louder. Sextus, filled with royal blood and arrogance, challenged to talk with action. "Let us ride now," he said, "and see whose wife is truly virtuous." And they did. Rode through the night, from one noble villa to another. Some wives were asleep, some were drinking. And then they reached Lucretia. She was awake, surrounded by maidservants, spinning wool, working by lamplight, exactly as a Roman wife should be. And all the men, even the king's son, fell silent. She welcomed them, offered hospitality, spoke softly. And when they left, it was clear Lucretia had won the contest. But what happens when virtue becomes not just admired, but desired, when it ceases to be a trait and becomes a prize? Days later, Sextus Tarquinius returned alone. He came in secret. At night, Lucretia, respectful of her husband's connection to the royal family, admitted him. He was a guest. She offered him lodging, and sometime that night, in the darkness, when her household was asleep, he entered her room with a sword. What he said, no one knows exactly. What tradition holds that he gave her a choice: surrender to him or die. And more than that, if she refused, he would kill her and then kill a male slave from her household, placing their bodies together and claiming he had caught them in the act. She would die, and her name would die with her, stained by imagined infidelity. It was not just the threat of death, it was the threat of erasure, disgrace. And so Lucretia submitted, and in the morning he left, not in shame, but in silence, a Roman prince, certain of impunity. But Lucretia did not remain silent. She sent messengers to her father in Rome, to her husband, to Lucius Junius Brutus, a family friend with quiet political ambition. When they arrived, she told them everything, calm, composed. She named Sextus Tarquinius. She demanded justice. And then, in the presence of all, she drew a dagger and plunged it into her chest. It was not death that she feared. It was dishonor. She died not to escape shame, but to preserve her legacy, to leave the world on her terms. The room exploded in grief, in fury. Her husband wept. Her father cursed the crown. And Brutus took up the dagger. He raised it high and swore, in front of all present, that no Tarquin would ever rule Rome again. It was not just a vow. It was a revolution. Lucretia's death became a catalyst. Her violated purity transformed into political momentum, and with it, the monarchy began to crumble. But what exactly did the Romans see in her story? Was it grief? Or was it the perfect excuse? Brutus held the dagger aloft. The blade still dripped with Lucretia's blood, a stain that could not be undone. But in that moment, it became more than evidence. It became a symbol. Brutus was not known for fire. He was a quiet figure. His name, Junius Brutus, carried a legacy of disappointment. His family had been sidelined. He had played the fool in the court of Tarquin the Proud, surviving only because the king thought him harmless. But Lucretia's death changed everything. Standing over her body, Lucretius transformed. He was no longer silent, no longer passive. He spoke not just of vengeance, but of revolution. Around him stood men of rank and consequence. Collatinus, the grieving husband; Lucretius, the father; Quicius Sulpicius, a respected officer. All of them shaken by grief, yes, but also by clarity. The monarchy had gone too far. It was not just the rape of Lucretia that incited them. It was the pattern. Quan had ruled with arrogance, bypassing the Senate, seizing power, silencing rivals. He had executed senators without trial. He had raised taxes. He had built temples, yes, but at the expense of liberty. Sextus, his son, was only the final straw. Lucretia's death gave them the public narrative they needed. And so they carried her body through the streets of Rome, openly, deliberately, a procession of mourning, yes, but also of fury. Crowds gathered, whispers spread, then shouts, then demands. The monarchy must end. Tarquin must go. This was not the first time Rome had felt the weight of a tyrant, but it was the first time the citizens had a story to hold. A noblewoman, innocent, violated by a prince, dead by her own hand. Her blood became the final proof that the king's rule was no longer just. Brutus addressed the crowd. He did not ask for a vote. He made a declaration. The Tarquins were expelled. The kingship was abolished. Rome would no longer be ruled by one man. Instead, 2 consuls would be elected annually, equal in power, accountable, temporary. The Roman Republic was born, and Lucretia, who had asked for no throne, no law, no legacy, became its martyr. But what happened after the shouting stopped? Cinna, of course, did not vanish quietly. He and his sons fled the city, but plotted return. They sought allies among the Etruscan cities, particularly Lars Porsena of Clusium, a powerful king who viewed Rome's republic as a dangerous experiment. The idea that people might govern themselves, that a king could be cast out, it was unsettling. Wars followed. Rome was attacked, besieged, and the young republic was forced to defend itself militarily, yes, but also morally. They invoked Lucretia's name like a battle cry. Hi, they told her story as proof of tyranny. Even those who had never met her began to speak of her as if she had been their sister, their daughter, their ideal. And slowly, her image hardened. She was no longer a woman. She was a virtue. Her pain became abstraction, her voice remembered. Only in death was replaced by political slogans. She had died for honor, and therefore the Republic was honorable. But there is a deep silence underneath that conclusion. What did it mean that Rome had needed her to die? Why was her suicide not just accepted, but demanded, praised, even immortalized? In Roman culture, honor was bound to the concept of pudictia, a kind of sexual and moral chastity expected of women. A violated woman, no matter how unwilling, was considered stained, not by the act, but by the outcome. Her worth, her role in society, was defined not by justice, but by perception. Lucretia's act, Cassius, then, was seen not as tragedy, but restoration. She removed herself to remove the shame. In doing so, she preserved her name and gave others permission to act. But that logic, that strange and brutal calculus, leaves unsettling questions. What if she had lived? Would her testimony have mattered? Would a living Lucretia have stirred a revolution? Or did she have to die in order for men to feel righteously wronged? In the Republic's early years, her story was taught to children. Her likeness was carved into family tombs. Her name appeared in speeches, in plays. In moral lessons, she was remembered, not for what she suffered, but for how she responded. And her death became the prototype. In later centuries, other Roman women would face dishonor and choose the blade, because to do otherwise, to survive and speak, was often seen as defiance. And so, the Republic, founded on liberty, began with a paradox. A woman's silence turned into a shout. A woman's death turned into a law. But could a government born of such a wound truly understand justice? Years passed. The monarchy did not return. Despite sieges, betrayals, and a string of wars that tested the fragile new order the Roman Republic held. And behind its institutions, the consuls, the Senate, the assemblies, stood the story of a single woman, Lucretia. She was not worshipped as a goddess. Rome reserved that for deities of war and wisdom. But she was remembered, revered, not for what she built, but for what her death had allowed others to destroy. In the early Republic, Lucretia's tale became a kind of civic ritual. Mothers recited it to their daughters. Fathers invoked her name as they explained what virtue meant. Her suicide was repeated not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. The lesson that a woman's honor was her highest possession, and that, when it was taken, the only honorable choice was silence or death for Roman women. This message cut deep. Unlike their Greek counterparts, Roman women could own property, influence family decisions, and occasionally wield informal power. But always, their status was tethered to reputation, to chastity, modesty, control. Their freedom was conditional, their value measured, and Lucretia became the yardstick. Her image appeared on coins, statues, paintings, Atia. She was shown at the moment of decision, the dagger raised, her face calm. Rarely did the artists show the moments before, the terror, the violation. The myth required purity, composure, sacrifice, even centuries later. As Rome expanded, conquered, and imperialized, her name remained. When Julius Caesar pushed the limits of republican power, his enemies evoked her again. They warned of tyranny, recalling how one man's lust had once toppled a kingdom. When Caesar was assassinated, some claimed it was in the tradition of Brutus, the same Brutus who had avenged Lucretia. And when Caesar's adopted son became Augustus, the first emperor, ushering in a new age of monarchy. The irony was complete. The republic that Lucretia's death had founded no longer existed. The lesson, however, endured far beyond Rome. In medieval Europe, Lucretia's story was retold in sermons and manuscripts. Renaissance thinkers debated her morality, her choice, her courage. Shakespeare gave her a poem. Shelley gave her a painting. In every retelling, her body remained a battlefield fought over by philosophers, theologians, artists. Was she right to kill herself? Was she wrong? Was she brave? Or was she simply obeying a culture that gave her no other choice? Modern historians approach her differently. They question whether she even existed in the form we know. Was she a real woman or a constructed figure, invented to explain a political break? Even Livy, writing centuries later, seemed unsure, but he told her story anyway. Because it worked. Because a republic founded on law, order, and citizenship still needed a myth. And Lucretia, whether historical or not, had become useful. But there is something quietly tragic beneath all this. Something still and unresolved. Lucretia was not a revolutionary. She did not seek to change the government. She did not write laws, command armies, or issue proclamations. She told the truth. And her truth, her assault, was turned into a slogan, one that empowered some, but silenced many more. Because once Lucretia became the gold standard of honor, any woman who responded differently, who lived, who fought, who bore the stain of assault without dying, was treated as less a suspect, dishonorable, and so, in freeing itself from a king, Rome inadvertently built a new kind of tyranny, one where morality was measured in martyrdom, and a woman's worth was preserved only if it ended in silence. The Republic would last for nearly 500 years. It would fall, eventually, into empire, into crowns, bloodlines, and again, into myths. But Lucretia's name remained, etched into marble, echoing through history books, attached to virtue, detached from pain. And perhaps that is her final legacy. Not just the end of monarchy, but the beginning of a tradition where women's suffering is not examined, only remembered as a useful symbol. But what if she had told her story and lived? What kind of republic might have emerged then? Asterisk. She was born in a village with no walls. No stone palaces, no scrolls of lineage, no banners. Just a church, a few fields, a family, and a war that had lasted longer than her lifetime. Domremy, in eastern France, lay caught in the wake of the 100 Years' War, a sprawling, erratic conflict that was not, in truth, one war, but a series of overlapping battles, rival dynasties, and shifting allegiances between England and France. By the time Jean Joan was born, France was fractured. The king had lost Paris. Entire regions were loyal to England. Villages burned. The people waited for a sign. And into this moment walked a teenage girl. She said she heard voices. She was 12 when they began, gentle at first, then urgent. The voices told her that France needed saving, that she, a peasant girl, was chosen, that she must go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned prince, and lead him to coronation, that the English must be driven out. It is easy to think of such a claim today as madness. But 15th century Europe was steeped in visions, saints, relics, and Joan spoke, not with wild eyes, but with calm certainty. She prayed, she fasted, she lived cleanly, and she declared, without irony or hesitation, that she had been sent by God. What made people listen? It was not her strength. She had no army. It was not her status. She had none. It was not her beauty, though later artists would imagine her as angelic. Was her purity. Joan was a virgin. And in medieval France, this meant everything. Virginity, especially in a woman claiming divine mission, became a kind of armor. It protected her from suspicion, at least at first. She dressed in men's clothes, trousers, tunics, boots, practical for a soldier, blasphemous for a woman. And yet, the church permitted it, because she claimed chastity. Men around her did not report indecency. Asterisk, they reported all. The Dauphin, Charles, desperate and half in hiding, agreed to see her. They tested her. They placed another man on the throne and hid Charles among courtiers. Joan walked in and bowed to the real prince. They questioned her theology, her knowledge of saints. She passed every test, and soon she was on horseback, at the head of troops, armor gleaming, standard in hand. She never killed. She never drew blood. She carried a banner, not a blade. And still the men followed. What did they see in her? Perhaps they believed in her visions. Perhaps they believed in France. Perhaps, most of all, they believed in the idea of a pure, woman-made instrument of God at Orleans. She broke the siege. The English retreated, and with them went the certainty that France would fall. Joan led Charles through hostile territory to Reims, the traditional site of coronation. There, in 1429, Charles was crowned King of France. A peasant girl had succeeded where princes and generals had failed. And yet, within a year, Joan was in chains, because once her purity was no longer politically useful, her power became dangerous. France had a crowned king. Her role, her purpose, was complete. And suddenly, the girl in armor became a problem. She was captured near Compiègne by Burgundian forces, allied with England, sold for ransom, and tried, not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic. Why? 'Cause Joan was no longer a virgin in the eyes of the court. Not morally, but symbolically. She had stepped out of place. She led men. She gave orders. She heard voices without clerical approval. She wore male clothing. These things were tolerated when she was needed, but now they were threats. The English and their allies could not kill her as a soldier. They had to kill her as a blasphemer, and that meant dismantling her claim to purity. At Rouen, a panel of church officials interrogated her, day after day. They accused her of witchcraft, of idolatry, of cross-dressing, the most visible and repeatable offense. She defended herself with clarity. She said she wore men's clothes for protection, that she had taken a vow, that God spoke to her. But the court did not want explanation. It wanted silence. Joan, still only 19, was condemned. Not for crimes of war, she had committed none, but for crimes of defiance, for being a girl who had acted without permission. They burned her in public, on a wooden scaffold in the market square. The flames consumed her slowly, and to be certain no relics could remain, they burned her ashes twice more, then scattered them into sand. There would be no miracles, no bones, no shrine, and yet her memory could not be destroyed, 'cause her death raised a deeper question, one that history never quite answers. Why do we need women to be virgins before we will believe them? Asterisk, Joan was dead, burned publicly, reduced to ash and legend, and yet, almost instantly, her memory began to smolder in a different way. Those who had watched the trial closely, clerics, notaries, common citizens, knew something was wrong. They had seen the questions. They had read the transcripts. They had heard her voice, calm and clear, in the face of trickery, because the trial of Joan of Arc was not meant to determine truth. It was a ceremony, a necessary performance by a church under English influence, needing to crush the idea that God might have spoken to a girl, especially one who'd helped crown the enemy's king. But they could not erase what she had done. She had broken the siege of Orleans. She had led men without title, without family, without land, and she had done it while preserving a reputation for chastity so strong that even her enemies hesitated to slander her personally. They wanted to condemn her theologically, not sexually, because even in trying to discredit her, they knew her power had come from purity, not just her military strategy, not her politics, not her faith alone, but the image of an untouched, uncorrupted woman whose virtue could shield a nation. But what is chastity when it is used as armor? Joan had insisted, again and again, that she had taken a vow of virginity, not out of fear, not out of submission, but as a calling. She believed deeply, stubbornly, that her mission came from God, and that, to fulfill it, she had to remain physically untouched. It was not just a moral position. It was a condition for her voice being heard. In medieval Europe, purity was power, but only as long as it remained intact. The moment a woman married, bore children, or admitted desire, her perceived authority on spiritual matters began to fade. Virginity gave Joan access to a kind of temporary male privilege. It let her wear armor, command troops, speak in council, but it was a bargain. She could lead, only if she remained unblemished. The moment she stepped outside that narrow role, not sexually, spiritually, she became suspect. The voices she heard were no longer seen as divine. Demonic, the same visions that once inspired men to follow her into battle were now used to convict her. At Rouen, she endured weeks of questioning. Sometimes they asked her to explain theology. Other times they tried to trap her with contradiction. At one point, they asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, a loaded question. To answer yes would be prideful. To answer no would admit sin. She answered, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me in it." The judges had no answer to that, but they still condemned her, because what they feared was not her answers, it was her certainty and her chastity. Once her shield had become proof of disobedience. She wore men's clothes in prison, not as rebellion, but for safety. Dressed as a woman, she feared assault. Dressed as a man, she felt secure. But the court used this choice as a wedge. They demanded she abandon her clothes and her vow. And when she briefly relented, under pressure and threat, they used that moment to declare her a relapsed heretic, a fate, punishable by fire. She was 19. The crowd that watched her execution included children. It was not a battlefield. It was not a moment of glory. It was slow, smoky, public, and yet, the silence that followed her death did not last. 2 decades later, a retrial was ordered, not by the English, but by the very French king she had helped crown, Charles VII. He had said little during her capture. He had done nothing to secure her release. But now, with this throne secure, the memory of Joan became useful again. The retrial examined the court documents, reviewed witness testimony. Surviving priests who had interrogated her admitted the original trial was unjust, political, corrupt. In 1456, 25 years after her death, Joan was declared innocent. Her conviction was annulled. Her name was cleared, but something stranger happened in the centuries that followed. She began to rise, slowly, into sainthood. Not officially, not yet, but in literature, in art, in myth, the French saw in her a kind of national soul. Not because she had conquered, but because she had believed, because she had remained untouched, because she had spoken and been burned for it, and in a country divided by war, then later by revolution, religion, and republics, Joan became a figure everyone could claim. The church admired her purity. The state admired her patriotism. The people admired her courage. But they all required one condition, that she remained the maiden, forever chaste, forever armored, forever burning. Joan of Arc, Jehan la Pucelle, was canonized in 1920, centuries after her bones were scattered in the river. And even in sainthood, she remains a paradox, praised for her purity, killed for her power, revered, not for being believed, but for being silenced. Because what is more useful than a virgin who cannot speak? Asterisk. By the time Joan of Arc was canonized in 1920, the France she had died for no longer existed. The monarchy was gone. The church's political power had faded. And yet, her image, swordless, speechless, shining, still stood in churches, town squares, and bronze memorials cast in permanence. But what had survived of Joan herself? What of the girl who never learned to read but dictated letters to kings? The girl who called herself Jahan, not Joan. The one who never claimed sainthood, only purpose. She had become something else entirely. Not just a figure of faith, not just a patriot. She had become a vessel into which each century poured its needs. In the 19th century, as France tried to define itself after revolution and empire, Joan was reimagined by royalists and republicans alike. To monarchists, she was the divinely guided servant of a rightful king. To republicans, she was the peasant girl who rose against occupation and clerical corruption. To Catholics, she was a martyr of chastity. To feminists, she was proof that women could lead armies, but none of these images fully aligned with the Joan who actually lived. She was too inconvenient, too strange, too real. She never sought fame. She claimed visions. She defied gender roles. She held power only briefly, and then was executed not as a soldier, but as a heretic. The image of Joan as the Maid of Orleans was always about more than victory. It was about control, because when women rise in history, their memory must be managed, and Joan's chastity, her perpetual virginity, made her manageable. It was the trait everyone could agree on. A girl in armor was threatening. A virgin in armor could be sanctified. Her celibacy made her untouchable. Literally and symbolically, she was above suspicion. She was a saint because she never strayed from the role. Men had decided she played best, the pure messenger. But what happens when purity is the only currency a woman is allowed? Even in sainthood, Joan's sexual status remains central. She is not Saint Joan the Brave, not Saint Joan the Just. She is the maid, as if her entire legacy rests not on her strategy or her courage, or her refusal to lie, but on the fact that she died, unkissed. History remembers her as holy, not because she heard voices, but because she kept her body sealed. But what if she had lived? What if she had grown older, fallen in love, married, had children? Would we still tell her story? Or does history only reward the girl who dies before she becomes too complicated? Today, school children in France still learn about Joan of Arc. Her trial records are read by scholars. Her words, "I am not afraid, for God is with me," are printed on posters, carved into stone. But her silence speaks louder, because when we talk about her now, we do so through the lens of those who killed her. 8. We admire her, but we do not. Hear her, she has become the patron saint of France, of soldiers, of prisoners, of people mocked for their faith. And yet, she is not allowed to grow or change, or live in our imagination as anything other than a pure young martyr. The fires that consumed her have long gone out, but the myth, clean, bright, and useful, still glows. Joan's story ends not with her voice, but with the silence that followed. And in that silence, we're left to wonder, what is the cost of being remembered only for the things you never touched? Asterisk, she arrived in chains, or maybe she walked. No one knows precisely how she came to the heart of the Ottoman world, whether she was dragged, bought, or surrendered. But what is certain is this: she did not begin as a queen. She was born around 1505, far from Istanbul, far from minarets and silk, in a small town, possibly Rahatyn, Triand in modern-day Ukraine, under the wide sky of Ruthenia, where girls were baptized Orthodox, winters bit hard, and families feared the thunder of hooves on the horizon, because that's how it began. A raid, Crimean Tatars, under Ottoman authority, swept into Slavic villages to take what they were owed: grain, livestock, and people. She was taken. Her name was lost, her birth name, that is. Historians speculate Anastasia Alexandra, but in the palace she would be renamed Harem, the joyful one, and to the Europeans she became Roxolana, a name that tied her always to the east, a girl from Ruthenia, a girl from nowhere. She was brought to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, the center of the Ottoman Empire, an empire that stretched from Hungary to the Red Sea, that controlled pilgrimage routes, silk roads, deserts, and mountains. The sultans ruled not from a throne, but from silence, power whispered through eunuchs, through chambers, through hallways filled with secrets. And she entered into this system not as a wife or a guest, but as a concubine. The harem, that mysterious, misunderstood space, was not merely a pleasure house. It was a political machine. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women lived within its walls. Some were enslaved, some were educated. Many were both. They were trained in languages, embroidery, poetry, manners, and, quietly, in the art of survival. Because the harem was as dangerous as it was luxurious. A woman's life could change with a glance, elevated by a pregnancy, destroyed by rumor. When Harem entered, the reigning sultan was Suleiman I, a tall, austere man with a poet's mind and a warrior's eye. He had inherited the empire from his father, Selim the Grim. He was young, he was ruthless, and he had already fathered a son by his favorite concubine, by Hadevran. Harem was meant to be background, but something shifted. She caught his attention and kept it. She did not look away when spoken to. She did not giggle or cower or disappear into the marble dot. And soon the balance of power tilted. She bore him a son, then another. Each birth secured her place. Child weakened Mahidevran's influence, but it was not just her fertility, it was her presence. Letters from Suleiman to Harem survived written when he was away on campaigns. He called her my unique, my beloved, the sultan of my heart. He asked after her health. He wrote poems. No previous concubine had received such words, and no previous concubine had refused, as Harem did, to leave the capital, even when custom demanded it, because, by Ottoman tradition, a concubine who bore a son was sent away with him to a provincial court. She was to live quietly, while her son learned to govern. It was a system designed to prevent any woman from growing too powerful at court. Harem stayed. She stayed in Istanbul. She remained beside Suleiman, and in doing so, she shattered protocol. There are no diaries from Harem, no voice, no confession, only the traces of her decisions. She rose, she maneuvered, she outlived her rivals, and in a move that stunned the empire, Suleiman married her, formally, publicly. She was no longer just a concubine. She was the legal wife of a sultan, the first in centuries. The palace recoiled. Courtiers whispered. Foreign ambassadors reported the scandal with disbelief. A slave girl now, the queen of the Ottoman world. But what did it cost her? What did it mean to rise so high, so fast, in a world that did not allow women to be seen, let alone heard? What did it mean to become powerful only by becoming pure in the eyes of a man? As Astrus, she had done the unthinkable. Roxolana, born a Christian, captured in a raid, trained as a concubine, had not only won the Sultan's favor, she had rewritten the unwritten laws of the Ottoman court. Suleiman married her, publicly, formally, and in doing so, he broke a tradition that had kept the empire's power structure in delicate balance for generations. No Ottoman sultan had married since the 14th century. Marriage, it was believed, gave too much influence to a single woman's family. Concubines had no lineage, no external loyalties. They were easier to control, easier to remove. But Harem Roxolana was different. Her family was gone. Her past erased. She owed loyalty only to the palace. And yet she used that position not to vanish quietly into silk cushions in prayer rooms, but to build something unprecedented, influence that reached far beyond the harem. She wrote letters to foreign monarchs, diplomats, ambassadors, Sigismund II, King of Poland, her likely homeland, to Catherine, the Queen of Poland and Lithuania. In eloquent Ottoman Turkish, laced with diplomatic grace, she praised their courts and sent gifts, sometimes fine fabric, sometimes healing waters. Her correspondence was not idle. It was strategy. A woman with no army, no title, no official power, and yet she was shaping foreign policy. And within the palace, her presence changed everything. She became a patron of architecture, commissioning mosques, soup kitchens, and schools. Her name was carved into foundations. Her emblem was engraved on endowments. She funded hospitals for the poor, wells for pilgrims, and lodgings for women. The most famous, the Hasaki Hurrem Sultan Mosque Complex, built by the imperial architect Mimar Sinan, a towering statement, not just of piety or permanence. She would not be erased. She was not temporary. She was now, in all but name, a queen. And yet, her power still depended on two things: her relationship with Suleiman and the perception of her virtue. It was not enough to be beloved. She had to be untouchable. She remained veiled, modest, charitable to the public. She was not the seductive slave girl of European fantasy. She was the dignified, pious consort, a mother, a benefactor, a woman who never looked at other men, but behind the scenes, the court swirled with danger. My Edevrin, Suleiman's former favorite, had borne his eldest son, Mustafa. Mustafa was strong, popular with the military, and respected. He had the clearest claim to the throne, but Irene had sons too, younger, untested, but hers. And in the Ottoman tradition of succession, the rules were brutal. There was no primogeniture. Any son could be sultan, and so brothers often killed each other to secure the throne. The stakes were life or death, not just for the princes, for their mothers. And so the rumors began that Hurrem plotted Mustafa's downfall, that she whispered in Suleiman's ear, that she manipulated court politics to have Mustafa accused of treason. None of it is proven. All of it is possible. In 1553, Suleiman ordered Mustafa's execution. The prince was lured into a tent during a campaign in Persia, strangled by eunuchs. No trial, no defense. The empire mourned, soldiers wept, cities rioted, and the blame, whispered, never shouted, fell on Hurrem. She had protected her sons. She had removed her rival, and in doing so, she had altered the path of imperial history. But what does it mean to survive in such a world? To outmaneuver other women, to navigate love, motherhood, and palace intrigue without ever stepping outside the gilded walls? Was Hurrem ambitious? Certainly. But ambition, for her, was not about glory. It's about survival. And survival, for a woman who began as property, was a kind of quiet revolution. She transformed the role of consort. She opened the door for future sultanas to wield real, visible power. But it all rested on a single, fragile image: that she had remained loyal, that she had remained chaste, that her rise was not seduction, but devotion. Because had she been seen as manipulative, or impure, or disloyal, her fate would have been sealed, and her name would have vanished. But she endured. And yet, with every step higher, did she ever wonder, would Suleiman still love her if she hadn't remained joyful? Would history still remember her if she had not stayed in her gilded cage? In Eten Wubai Wushaba, Hurrem Sultan Roxolana died, not by poison, not by political betrayal, not in disgrace, but quietly in Istanbul after years of illness. In the palace she had made her own. Her death marked the end of an extraordinary arc, from a stolen village girl to the legal wife of one of the most powerful men on earth, a man who had ruled for nearly half a century, who had shaped the Ottoman Empire into a continental force, who had written poetry under the name Mahibi and wept for his sons. And yet, at the end of it all, Suleiman was buried, not beside his firstborn heir, nor beside his ancestors. He was buried beside her. It was an astonishing decision, okay, and one that made their partnership visible permanently. Etched into the skyline of Istanbul, their twin tombs still stand within the Süleymani Mosque complex. Quiet, majestic, intimate, asterisk. She was no longer just a wife. She was legacy. But what kind? In the decades that followed her death, Hurrem's reputation shifted like the tide. European observers, already suspicious of the harem, painted her as a temptress, a schemer, an Eastern Delilah who had bent an emperor to her will. Venetian diplomats called her manipulative. French writers described her as dangerous. Painters imagined her reclining on cushions, surrounded by silks and serpents, a fantasy built not on records, but on fear. They could not reconcile the idea of a powerful woman whose influence came not from scandal, but from devotion, whose survival rested not on beauty alone, but on intelligence, restraint, and adaptation within the empire. However, Hurrem became something else, a model, a prototype. Her life ushered in what historians now call the Sultanate of Women, a period during the 16th and 17th centuries when imperial consorts and mothers played significant roles in governance. Her daughter, Mirama, became a patron of architecture and trade. Her sons, Selim and Bazid, vied for power. Her descendants would rule, fall, and rise again, but none of them would escape her shadow. Her reign had proved that a woman, even a concubine, could shape empire, but always through a delicate formula: purity plus proximity plus silence. She had never led troops, never issued orders from a throne, never stood in the divan, the imperial council, and yet her presence steered decisions, alliances, and successions. She was not behind the curtain. She was the curtain, but the cost of such control was constant invisibility. To remain powerful, she had to remain mythic, unblemished, contained. Her name, Hurrem, the joyful one, was repeated often, but what did she laugh at? Truly, was it joy or necessity? Did she think of her village? Did she think of the life she might have had, not in gold, but in ordinary peace? In her letters, she never mentioned Ruthenia, never asked about family, never recalled her childhood. Either it was too painful, or she had learned long ago. That memory was dangerous. Her tomb bears her name in script, a crown of turquoise tiles. Inside her sarcophagus lies, among others, royal children, grandchildren, and yet she remains singular. The woman who changed the palace from within. But what happens when power is built on purity? Was her story celebrated because she triumphed, or because she played the game so well? The Ottoman court would remember her as a turning point, a woman whose presence had to be explained, justified, eventually revered. But the truth is quieter. Hurrem lived and died by unwritten rules. To be pure, she had to be loyal. To be powerful, she had to be invisible. To be remembered, she had to stay within the lines. And yet, she crossed every one of them without open rebellion, without a sword, without leaving the palace. She proved that survival for women in empire was itself a form of genius, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is remain. Asterisk. The room was cold, stone walls thick with age, candles guarded in their sconces, and in the middle, seated like a figure in a painting, was a queen who would become legend, Isabella of Castile, born in 1451. In a kingdom torn between cousins and claimants, Isabella grew up surrounded by war, piety, and calculation. She was never meant to rule. Her older half-brother, Henry IV, held the crown of Castile, erratic, childless, and politically fragile. Her path to power was not carved by inheritance, but by silence, waiting, and the careful weaponization of her image. From a young age, she was marked by severity. She prayed longer than others. She fasted often. She spoke with calm conviction. She was a woman who understood early that piety could protect when marriage was proposed. As it often was, Isabella refused to be auctioned. She rejected the King of Portugal. She rejected a union with the House of Aragon until she could choose the prince herself. That prince was Ferdinand. They married in secret, without the full consent of the Castilian crown. But by the time the protests died down, it was too late. She was married. And when her half-brother died in 1474, Isabella claimed the throne of Castile as her own, not as queen consort, not as Corolla. As sovereign, it was an act of boldness in a world that still debated whether women could rule at all. But Isabella did not present herself as a warrior queen. She had no need to. She presented herself as a virgin monarch, a woman guided by divine principle, not personal desire. Even though she was married, and later a mother of 5, her public image was carefully preserved. She dressed modestly. She carried prayer books. She walked among soldiers not as a figure of passion, but of righteousness. The veil became her symbol, not just as a garment, but as an idea. She was veiled in reputation, in moral clarity, in the thick linen of religion, and with that moral authority, she ruled. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, began to stitch together a new Spain, not just politically, but religiously. Her reign would be defined by 3 brutal projects: the completion of the Reconquista. For centuries, Muslim kingdoms had ruled much of the Iberian Peninsula. By the late 15th century, only Granada remained. Isabella led, not by sword, but by sanction. She rode with the army, lived among soldiers in campaign tents, and offered penance, not pity. In 1492, the last Muslim emir surrendered. Spain was once again Christian officially, if not entirely. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. In 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand received papal permission to begin an inquisition, not to root out non-Christians, but to ensure the sincerity of converts. Jews who had converted under pressure were watched, interrogated, and often tortured. The Inquisition operated with secrecy and terror, burning books, people, records. It was state control cloaked in theology. The expulsion of the Jews. In March 1492, weeks after Granada fell, Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree. It gave all Jews in Spain for months to convert or leave. An estimated 40,000 to 100,000 were expelled. Families were uprooted. Property seized. A culture of centuries was scattered. And yet, too many in Europe, Isabella was admired, not for her cruelty. Quote, she was hailed as La Catolica, the Catholic queen, a woman uncorrupted by the temptations of court, a ruler whose femininity was bound not to seduction, but sanctity. Her virginity, or rather, the perception of it, became a tool. Though she had children, she was never portrayed as maternal in the sensual sense. Instead, she was the mother of Spain, a metaphor given flesh. And then came the voyage. Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailor with questionable maps and endless bravado, sought a patron. Many had refused. But Isabella, after initial hesitation, agreed. The reasons were complex. Some were political, some economic, some religious. The hope of reaching the East, converting souls, spreading the faith. But when the voyage succeeded, when Columbus returned, not with spices, but with stories of new lands, the myth of Isabella reached its final transformation. She was not just Queen of Castile. She was now the Christian mother of a global empire, and it all rested on her body, her image, her chastity. The church praised her. Chronicles described her as more man than woman, by which they meant incorruptible, pious, unwavering. In portraits, she is never smiling. She wears heavy cloth. Her hands are folded in prayer. She is not sensual. She is sacred, and in that image, forged in court, in battlefield tents, in confessionals, Spain found its license to conquer, to convert, to burn. But what does it mean when a woman's virtue is used to justify centuries of violence? Asterisk, Isabella of Castile, governed with rosary beads in one hand and royal decrees in the other. And while kings before her had sought gold or land, Isabella pursued something harder to measure: spiritual order, unity, purity in the eyes of her court and clergy. She was not merely a queen. She was God's chosen instrument, not because she claimed divine right. That was a common phrase among monarchs, but because she lived as though she had been elected by heaven itself. Her mornings began in prayer. She fasted. She wore simple clothing, even after she had crowned an empire. She refused to adorn herself with jewels unless diplomacy required it. And when she ruled, she did so as a woman visibly guided by principle, not pleasure. It was that visibility, that deliberate display of restraint, that made her so powerful. Isabella's image was everything. She was not an empress of indulgence, not a queen of feasts or dances. She was severe, controlled, almost monastic, and because of that, she became the ultimate symbol of Catholic rule. After the conquest of Granada in 1492, she ordered mosques to be converted into churches. Muslim libraries, vast collections of astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were burned or hidden. Some books were translated, most were lost. Asterisk, but it wasn't just architecture or language that she changed. It was the soul of the land. Isabella believed that religious conformity was political strength. And in an age where borders were fragile and rebellions frequent, uniformity became her obsession. Her policies followed the same logic. If the queen is pure, then the nation must be pure. And so the Inquisition expanded. It was never just about heretics. It was about control. Asterisk. Clergy and inquisitors roamed the streets with permission to inspect houses, interrogate neighbors, and destroy evidence of alternative belief. Eating meat on the wrong day, lighting candles on Friday nights, reciting prayers in unfamiliar languages. These became punishable acts. Thousands were tortured. Confessions were extracted. Bodies were burned in autos.f, acts of faith, while crowds watched, and still, Isabella's name remained unstained. She never lifted the rack, never ordered a pyre, but she signed the decrees. She appointed the priests, protected the process. Her faith, fierce, disciplined, and public, provided a moral shield for unspeakable actions. And then came the Americas. Columbus's return in 1493 brought tales of lands untouched by Christ, of people with no knowledge of the cross, of vast resources waiting to be claimed. Isabella responded not with hunger, but with mission. She wrote explicitly of her desire to bring the light of God to the Indies, to baptize, to save. She issued instructions that the natives should not be enslaved, that they should be treated as free subjects of the crown, that their souls should be nurtured. But thousands were enslaved anyway, in the empire's bureaucracies, far from her palace in Castile. Slowly transformed her ideals into machinery. What began as spiritual conquest became economic exploitation. Indigenous labor was extracted under the encomienda system. Toll villages disappeared. Disease followed ships like smoke. In Spain, under the cross, under the crown, grew rich. But back in Castile, Isabella remained the virgin queen of empire. Her personal discipline shielded her from political fallout. She did not dance. She did not drink. She was, by all accounts, faithful to Ferdinand, despite his many affairs and portraits. Her face remained stern, a symbol of order in an age of fire, even as conquests spread across oceans, even as cities were renamed and churches erected atop sacred lands. Her image never changed, a ruler untainted by vice, and yet her body, her modest, quiet, disciplined body, had become the standard by which all others were judged. Women who wore veils were virtuous. Women who danced were suspect. Women who questioned were silenced, and across oceans. This moral blueprint was applied to indigenous women, too. Nakedness became sin. Matrilineal customs became barbaric, okay? And those who would not convert were shamed, beaten, or buried. The queen never saw the Americas. She never stepped on the soil, she claimed. But her vision shaped everything, because Isabella's purity had come empire's permission. Her death came in 1504, okay? After a long illness. She left behind not only children, but kingdoms. She had unified Spain, in theory, if not fully in practice. She had authorized voyages that would change the world. She had signed edicts that scattered centuries of Jewish culture. She had empowered inquisitors who turned prayer into surveillance. And she had done it all while cloaked in devotion. No scandal ever touched her. No court gossip survived. Even her enemies admitted. She was incorruptible. But incorruptibility can become a kind of violence too, when it demands that everyone else match its impossible standards. What does it mean to rule through purity? And what happens to the world when virtue becomes law? Asterisk, when Isabella of Castile died in 1504. She was laid to rest in Granada, the city she had conquered, the city she had claimed in God's name. Her tomb, built later in marble, lay next to Ferdinand's. They are carved together, hands folded, eyes closed. But Isabella's death marked more than the passing of a queen. It marked the end of one phase of empire and the beginning of something even greater, a system of global conquest cloaked in the shadow of her virtue. In her will, Isabella expressed final thoughts, not of gold, but of faith. She reaffirmed her desire for the indigenous people of the Americas to be treated well and converted with compassion. She asked that her daughters follow the church. She asked that her legacy be one of piety, and yet her legacy became something else, the purity she had performed so precisely through dress, practice, and decision became not just memory, but mandate. In her absence, others tried to live up to the idea of her, but the idea was impossible. She had ruled as a sovereign, a wife, and a mother, but her image had been preserved as something else, a secular saint. Her body, though married and fertile, had been interpreted as veiled, untouched, moral, the foundation of a unified, cleansed Christian kingdom. And so her successors ruled not with her discipline, but with her myth. Her grandson, Charles V, became Holy Roman Emperor, inheriting not just Spain, but Austria, the Netherlands, and vast overseas colonies. Expanded the Inquisition. He waged wars in her name. By the mid-16th century, Spain was no longer a fragmented land of courts and languages. It was a machine, and its gears had been greased by the example Isabella set, that to conquer righteously, one must appear spotless. Her daughter, Joanna, inherited Castile, but was declared mentally unfit. Her grandson, Philip II, built the Escorial, an austere palace monastery, in tribute to Catholic virtue. He burned heretics, fought Protestants, and married queens, but he could never embody the simplicity, the moral clarity that Isabella had projected in the Americas. Her portrait hung in cathedrals to the indigenous people who saw her face painted above altars. She was the queen who had sent the ships, to the missionaries who preached under her banners. She was the mother of the New World. But how did her image look to the women whose languages were banned, whose gods were destroyed, whose bodies were dressed, named, and judged in foreign tongues? Isabella had ordered compassion, for her example and justified judgment in the centuries that followed. She became a standard against which female rulers and all women were measured. Was she obedient? Was she faithful? Was she modest? These became questions not only for queens, but for wives, daughters, subjects. And over time, the those questions left Europe and arrived on other shores. In Mexico, in Peru, in the Philippines, women were taught to admire the Virgin Queen, not Elizabeth of England, but Isabella of Spain, a ruler who had never laughed in public, never danced in excess, never shown appetite or weakness. Her Catholicism became global, not because of what she said, but because of what she was believed to represent. And yet, Isabella was never canonized. Twice, her cause for sainthood was raised. Both times, it stalled. Why? Perhaps the church hesitated to elevate a woman whose legacy was stained by forced conversions. Perhaps her politics were too sharp, her reach too wide. Perhaps sainthood would have demanded a more passive example. But in practice, she was already treated as one. In textbooks, she was listed alongside heroes. In prayer books, she was cited for her holiness. In politics, her name was evoked as precedent. And across time, her legacy did not fade. It multiplied through wars of religion, through missionary voyages, through schoolroom lectures about the birth of Spain. Even today, her image floats quietly through national memory as a woman who brought peace through discipline and order through piety. But what was sacrificed for that order? Cultures, languages, libraries. She died in her 50s, worn from childbirth, campaigning, prayer. She left behind a blueprint so rigid, so controlled, that it would hold Spain together for centuries and quietly suffocate anything that did not fit within it. Her veil, literal and metaphorical, became the fabric of empire, and in the quiet marble of her tomb, where her lips do not speak and her hands do not tremble, one can almost hear the question echo: was it her purity that made her powerful, or our need for purity that made her unforgettable? Asterisk, she came to Portugal as a lady-in-waiting, a foreigner, background figure in someone else's marriage. Her name was Inés de Castro, a Galician noblewoman, well-born, well-mannered, and entirely unremarkable to history. When she first arrived at the Portuguese court in the 1340s, she was not destined for power. She was not meant to rule. She was there for decoration, for courtesy, for company. But fate and the appetite of a prince had other plans. Crowned Prince Pedro of Portugal was married to her cousin, Constanza of Castile. It was a political match designed to secure ties between two uneasy kingdoms. Constanza was pious, careful, and dutiful. She gave Pedro heirs. She did not stir drama, and yet Pedro was drawn not to her, but to Inés. No one knows when it began, whether it was glances in corridors, words whispered between doorways, or a love that bloomed slowly under the vines of Coimbra. But by the early PAs, it was undeniable. The prince loved Inés. It was not just a passing affair. It was obsession. He defied his father's wishes. He kept Inés at court. He ignored his wife and visited Inés openly. The nobility recoiled. This was more than infidelity. It was a threat to dynastic stability. Asterisk. Because Inés, though noble, was not Castilian royalty. And worse, her family, the House of Castro, was ambitious. Her brothers held posts of influence in Castile. Her presence at court and her proximity to the heir began to look less like romance and more like infiltration. King Alfonso IV, Pedro's father, warned his son, then begged him and ordered him, remove her, stint her away. Forget her, Pedro refused. Even after Constanza died in childbirth in 1345, freeing him to remarry, Pedro did not rush to make a new political match. He brought Inés even closer. She bore him children. They lived together in Coimbra as though they were wed, though no marriage was declared. And slowly, a quiet panic spread through the royal court, because if Inés became queen, her children could one day rule. And with them, the Castro influence would take root in Portuguese soil. Alfonso IV saw danger where his son saw only devotion. And so, in 1355, while Pedro was away hunting, the king acted. 3 counselors, men of the court, were sent to Coimbra. They entered the gardens of the palace. There, they found Inns. She was unarmed. She did not flee. Some say she pleaded. Some say she stood silent. But she was executed. Some chronicles say she was stabbed. Others say beheaded. Always in front of her children. Her body was buried hastily in a monastery outside Coimbra when Pedro returned. The damage was done. His father defended the decision. It had been for the kingdom to protect the line, to prevent foreign influence. But Pedro, now a grieving lover, declared it murder. He refused to remarry. He withdrew from court. And for 2 years, he waited. When King Afonso IV died in 1357, Pedro ascended the throne. And then the legend truly began, because now he had the crown. Now he had power. And the woman he could never protect in life, he would elevate in death. But how does one honor a love destroyed by politics? What does justice look like when purity has already been buried? Asterisk, when Pedro became king of Portugal in 1357. No one expected him to rule with softness. He had spent the final years of his father's reign in slow-burning fury, not the public kind, not with trumpets or armies, but with something far more unsettling: silence. A deliberate, measured quiet that said more than any speech. For the death of Inns had not just taken his love, it had taken his trust in the world around him, now crowned. Pedro moved swiftly and strangely, not to conquer, not to expand, but to unearth the past. Literally, the first act was revenge. He hunted down the 3 men who had executed Inns under the orders of his late father. 2 of them, Paro Coelho and Alvaro Gonçalves, had fled into exile, thinking they were safe from royal punishment. They weren't. Pedro's men found them, captured them, and brought them back to Portugal. Their trial was short. Their punishment, not just execution, but demonstration, according to some accounts, especially those repeated in later centuries. Pedro ordered their hearts torn from their chests, one through the front, one through the back, symbolic punishment. A man who had murdered love must lose the very organ that made it possible. There is no certainty to this version. Some say it was embellished into telling, a flourish to heighten Pedro's grief into legend. But whether or not the punishment was as gory as the stories say, it is fact that the killers of Inns were captured and executed by Pedro's orders. But revenge was not enough. He wanted recognition. He wanted history itself to kneel before the woman who had died for love. And so, in an act that has made him infamous among Europe's strangest monarchs, he made a declaration. He had married Inns de Castro in secret before her death. She had been his lawful queen. There were no witnesses, no documents, only his word. But Pedro was king now, and kings do not ask, they announce. He summoned the court to the monastery of Alcobaça, where Inns's remains had been transferred in a funeral fit for royalty. There, beneath the stone arches, Pedro did something even stranger. He had Inns's body exhumed, clothed in royal garments. And according to legend, crowned, the stories say he placed her on a throne beside his own, that the courtiers were forced to kiss her hand to swear fealty to a corpse. Some historians argue this never happened, that it was metaphor, not action, that the coronation of a dead woman was symbolic, but the funeral was real. The honors were real. The tombs built afterward still exist today, testaments of stone to a love declared after death. Pedro commissioned some matching tombs at the monastery of Alcobaça, masterworks of Gothic art, one for himself, one for Inns, each carved with angels, vines, and the story of their love, and on both an inscription, 8 O Vim Tu Mundo, until the end of the world. They were placed facing each other. So that on Judgment Day, according to legend, the first thing they would see would be each other. A love defied in life, vindicated in death. Yet, all this spectacle left a lingering question. Did Pedro truly marry Inns before her death? Oh, was this the fantasy of a grieving man who mistook devotion for justice? Terrace, no proof, only consequences. Because now, with Inns declared queen, her children, once considered illegitimate, could claim royal blood. And that would shape the line of succession for years to come. The court, which had opposed her in life, now found her ghost embedded in the structure of power, her name written where it had once been erased. But still, the question remained, was this love powerful enough to rewrite history? Or was it merely the story of a king so heartbroken that he made the past obey his grief? Asterisk, in the years after Inés de Castro was declared Queen of Portugal, her absence grew heavier than her presence ever had. She no longer haunted Pedro's palace in whispered rumors or the delicate silence of court etiquette. Now, she haunted Portugal itself, in marble, in law, in legacy. Pedro, once known as the impulsive prince who loved dangerously, became something else entirely, a king who ruled with remembrance. His governance, to the surprise of many, was marked not by vengeance, but by a striking sense of order. Perhaps grief had softened him, or perhaps, in naming Inns as queen, he felt he had balanced the scales. Ken could now turn toward peace, but even peace was tinged with melancholy. He issued laws that favored protection over punishment, that softened feudal abuses and leaned into the ideals of chivalry, not the battlefield kind, but the quieter, courtly kind that seemed to rise from songs and sadness. Pedro governed with restraint, almost like a man who had no more to prove, and yet the shadow of Inns touched every corner of his reign. Their children, especially Joel and Dinas, gained prominence, while not crowned in Pedro's lifetime. They were now considered royal by blood, legitimate in name, but they were not the heirs. That title belonged to Fernando, Pedro's son from his official marriage to Constanza. When Pedro died in 1367, it was Fernando who inherited the throne. Still, the story of Inns outlived Pedro, outlived Fernando. It outlived the court that had tried to erase her, because what Pedro had done, by declaring her queen, by punishing her killers, by building monuments in her name, was turned private grief into public memory. He made her into a symbol, not just of love, but of a political ghost that refused to disappear. And that ghost would haunt Portuguese identity for centuries. Poets, painters, and playwrights would return to her story again and again. Inns became a legend, a woman who died because her love threatened power, a queen who wore her crown in death, a martyr of feeling in a world ruled by function. But beneath the mythology lies a quieter, sadder truth. Inns de Castro, in life, was never queen. She was a noble woman caught in the gears of politics, executed not because of who she was, but because of what her presence might cause. Her love for Pedro, if we believe in it, was her only shield, and even that wasn't enough. She didn't lead armies, she didn't issue laws, she didn't even speak much in the chronicles written about her. Instead, she's remembered for how she died, and for how her lover refused to let her be forgotten. And yet, this raises one final unnerving thought. What if Pedro had fabricated the marriage? What if his love for Inns, however genuine, had been used to advance his children, solidify his rule, and wrap himself in a legend more beautiful than truth? Can love, however powerful, justify the rewriting of history? Or are we simply seduced by the poetry of it all? The idea of a man so devoted that he crowned a corpse and made the world bow. Inns' story leaves us with a tangle of contradictions, fact and legend, justice and vengeance, love and politics, truth and performance. And in that tangle lies the heart of the matter, not in whether Inns was truly queen, but in how one woman's purity, love, and death shaped the identity of a nation long after her body had turned to dust, because history does not always remember the rulers. Sometimes it remembers the mourned asterisk in the year 1377. A 14-year-old girl named Maria found herself at the center of one of the most precarious power struggles in the Mediterranean. She was crowned Queen of Sicily, not by triumph, not by desire, and certainly not by conquest, but by birthright. She was the only child of Frederick the Simple, a king whose rule had been anything but. His reign had been weighed down by external threats and internal instability, his grasp on power often more symbolic than effective. When he died, he left behind not a son or a warrior, but a teenage daughter with auburn hair and a quiet, uncertain voice. Asterisk. Maria, unwed, unprepared, unprotected, but sovereign nonetheless. The moment her father was buried, Maria became a prize. Not in the romantic sense. There were no princes writing poetry or dashing across the sea to win her favor. Rather, she became a political asset to be controlled, her body a placeholder for the crown. Her virginity, like an unspoiled parchment, was now a battleground for barons, kingdoms, and family alliances, because whoever married Maria would rule Sicily, and everyone knew it. Sicily, at that time, was fractured, not merely by geography, but by allegiance. The noble families of the island were powerful, wealthy, and deeply ambitious. They ran cities like Palermo and Catania, like personal fiefdoms, with private militias and foreign backers. Many of them paid lip service to the crown, but they ruled themselves in practice. When Maria inherited the throne, these men didn't gather to support her. They gathered to cage her. The most powerful among them, the so-called vicars, were 4 noblemen who had sworn to protect the young queen and uphold her authority. But their pledge was hollow. In reality, each saw her as leverage. Among them was Artelli Alagona, a baron from Catania whose military mind and Sicilian pride clashed violently with other factions. There was also Francesco Ventimiglia and Manfredi Chiaramonti, each heading their own rival regions. And then there was Guglielmo Perrotta, K., an ambitious magnate backed by ties to the Aragonese royal family in Spain. Together, these 4 men agreed to act as stewards of the kingdom until Maria was of age. But in truth, they formed a rotating dictatorship, carving Sicily into quarters and playing politics with the girl queen's life like pieces on the chessboard. Maria herself, she had no say. She was moved like a prisoner from one fortress to another. Sometimes she was in Palermo, sometimes Messina. Other times she vanished from the records entirely, spirited away for safety, a word that often meant control. Always guarded, always watched. She was rarely allowed to write freely. Her education was interrupted. Her own household servants were chosen by the barons. They dressed her, fed her, assigned her tutors, and filtered her correspondence. The throne room might have had her name on it, but the throne itself was empty. Still, the question of her purity hovered like a storm cloud over all, so long as Maria remained unmarried. And more importantly, untouched. She remained politically viable. If one of the barons managed to marry her secretly, it would be a coup. If a foreign kingdom smuggled in a suitor, Sicily could be absorbed into another crown. Everyone wanted her to marry, but no one could agree on to whom to delay that choice. The barons imprisoned her with velvet gloves, not in dungeons, but in walled villas and castle towers where the windows were narrow and the doors always bolted. One day, according to a chronicle written by Niccolo Speciali, Maria attempted to send a message to the outside world using a servant loyal to her mother's side of the family. The letter never made it. A servant was caught, and Maria was swiftly relocated to a coastal keep in Licata, far from prying eyes. No trial, no confrontation, it's just silence. The barons declared they were protecting her, but protectiveness in politics is often indistinguishable from possession. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, foreign powers began to whisper. The House of Aragon, which ruled parts of Spain and had a long-standing claim over Sicily through dynastic ties, began to agitate. They saw Maria as a potential bridge, a way to consolidate control over the Mediterranean and secure shipping routes between the Iberian Peninsula and Italy. If they could marry Maria to one of their own, the island would fall neatly into Fave place. But Sicilian nationalists, led by Alagona and others, saw this as a betrayal. They accused the other barons of selling out to foreign interests. Fights broke out. Cities were besieged, and Maria, the so-called queen, continued to vanish behind locked gates and secret transfers, a teenager under house arrest, while wars were waged in her name. Through it all, one fact remained unchanged. She was still a virgin, because her political power lived in that fact. It was not her military strength, not her bloodline, not her words that kept kingdoms at bay. It was her body, unmarried, unspoiled, a placeholder for a future no one could agree on. And so we pause here, with Maria watching the horizon from a seaside tower, waiting for a future that had nothing to do with her own choices. Is this what monarchy truly was for women? Game played by others, using your skin as currency? Or was there still time, still a window, however small, for her to change the rules before it was too late? Asterisk, by the summer of 1379. Maria had been missing for over a year. The people of Sicily, those who still believed in the crown, whispered of her death. Others suspected she had been married in secret. The barons who controlled the island offered no answers, and the vicars continued to govern in her name, issuing decrees that bore her seal but not her signature. But Maria was not dead, nor had she married. Not yet. She was alive and closely watched, held in the fortress of Licata under the supervision of the Alagona family, the same family that claimed to protect her sovereignty. They kept her secure under the banner of patriotism. But it was not loyalty that guided them. It was calculation. Maria had become a pawn, so valuable that no one dared play her, unless the game could be rigged first. And yet, Sicily smoldered in political deadlock. One man quietly prepared a different plan. His name was Martin of Aragon, son of the King of Aragon, and cousin to many of the barons scheming on the island. Martin was young, ambitious, and aware of the power a single union could bring. His father, Peter IV of Aragon, had long wanted to bring Sicily under firm Aragonese control. Maria, a girl he had never met, was the key to that ambition. But Martin didn't send ships or soldiers. He sent his brother-in-law, William Raymond of Moncada, on a mission far more dangerous: to steal the queen. William Raymond was a nobleman of Catalan birth, clever, audacious, and known for his ability to operate in the shadows. Disguised as a merchant emissary, he arrived in Sicily under the pretense of brokering trade deals between the crown of Aragon and the barons of Palermo. In truth, he had no interest in trade. His instructions were clear: locate Maria, break her out, and bring her directly to Martin, by force if necessary. It was a reckless plan. The Alagona family was known for brutality, and Licata's fortress was a well-guarded outpost. But secrecy, not siegecraft, proved decisive. One night in 1379, during a storm so violent that guards retreated indoors, a small armed band, led by William Raymond, infiltrated the keep. Whether they bribed the guards or scaled the walls is still debated by historians, but the result is recorded in multiple chronicles. Maria was taken from her bed and smuggled out of the fortress in the dead of night. Some accounts claim she resisted. Others suggest she cooperated, understanding that her only path to power lay in marriage, and this was perhaps her only offer not brokered by the vicars. Either way, she was gone by morning. By the time the Alagona family realized the breach, Maria was already halfway across the Strait of Messina. A swift Aragonese galley awaited her at Reggio Calabria. From there, she was taken to the fortified city of Licata in Spain. And on a quiet autumn day in 1380, Maria of Sicily, queen without power, prisoner without crime, was married to Martin of Aragon in a small chapel under armed protection. No grand ceremony, no parade, just vows and legitimacy. The effect on Sicily was immediate. The vicars were caught off guard. Their entire political framework, ruling in Maria's name while controlling her movements, collapsed. Yet assumed her body could be contained indefinitely, her virginity guarded like a coffer of gold. But now she was married, not to a baron, not to a Sicilian noble, but to the son of Aragon, a foreign prince with real armies and deeper ambitions. Suddenly, Maria was no longer a captive. She was a queen with a king. The island erupted. The vicars turned on one another. Artali Eligorna accused Chiaramonte of failing in his duty. Carauta, who had Aragonese ties, claimed neutrality. Cities loyal to Maria celebrated her return to agency, even if through marriage. Cities loyal to the barons denounced the union as illegitimate and treasonous. But the deeper question was simpler. Did this marriage truly free Maria, or merely transfer her captivity? Martin was no tyrant, but he was also no romantic. His marriage to Maria was a tactical decision, one that brought him closer to dominion over Sicily. And while he respected her title, his political instincts overshadowed any notion of partnership. Maria found herself in a new kind of confinement, one where the chains were diplomatic. The cage was a court filled with advisors. She did not choose. Still, she was no longer invisible. Maria began to sign decrees again. Her name appeared on letters, orders, and royal seals. She returned to Palermo, not as a ward, but as a queen. And this time, she was escorted by soldiers loyal to Aragon. Her former captors were furious. Artali Alagona, Keeling cornered, raised a private army, and began seizing towns along Sicily's eastern coast. Freddy Chiaramonte declared Maria's marriage invalid and fortified Agrigento, turning it into a rebel stronghold. The island plunged into a low-grade civil war. Maria's crown on one side, the disillusioned barons on the other. But Maria held firm. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she was not merely being acted upon. She made decisions. She summoned advisors she trusted. She ordered city governors to swear loyalty directly to her, bypassing the barons. And in at least 2 cases, she stripped titles from noblemen who had previously been untouchable. It was not revolution. It was something subtler. A woman, once imprisoned for her purity, now using the weight of marriage to fight for political identity. But the tide was far from certain. Martin, now her husband and co-ruler, had ambitions beyond Sicily, and as external. Wars pulled him away from the island. Maria was once again left to manage chaos with limited means. She had legitimacy, but little control. She had freedom, but only as much as Martin permitted. And so she stood in her court in Palermo, issuing orders to cities that didn't answer, just waging a war for influence over nobles who had grown used to ruling without her. Was this sovereignty, or simply another illusion of power? How long can a queen remain sovereign when a reign is always subject to someone else's sword? By the early 1390s, the dust of Maria's unexpected marriage to Martin of Aragon had not yet settled. Sicily remained a fragmented landscape, a patchwork of fortified cities, baronial fiefdoms, and rival courts, all claiming to represent the legitimate authority of the crown. But the crown itself, the one Maria wore, had changed shape entirely. The quiet queen, once a captive whose virginity justified a kingdom's war, now found herself caught in the slow, grinding fatigue of governance. The barons no longer fought her in open defiance. They resisted with silence, decrees ignored, taxes withheld, alliances unspoken. This wasn't a dramatic rebellion. It was a war of attrition. Against a woman whose authority was always conditional, Maria ruled, but only where her husband allowed her to. Martin, now styled as King of Sicily by marriage, grew more powerful than Maria herself in the eyes of foreign courts. Though they ruled jointly in name, Martin handled foreign affairs, led military campaigns, and positioned Aragonese influence ever deeper into Sicilian politics. His voice was louder, his armies larger, his ambitions broader. Maria's presence, though regal, was increasingly ceremonial, and yet, within the confines of this ceremonial role, she fought, not with swords or edicts, but with memory. She reminded the island, again and again, who she was. Not Martin's queen, but Frederick III's daughter, the last of the Sicilian Trinacria line. She knew the island's history better than most. She knew that Sicily had long resisted outside control, whether by the Angevin French, the papacy, or the crown of Aragon. She played that knowledge into the rituals of state, hosting public masses that honored her father's reign, commissioning scrolls that documented her lineage, elevating minor noble families native to the island over foreign ones brought in by her husband's court. It was symbolism. But in politics, symbols could outlive swords. Still, Maria's world was shrinking. In 1391, Martin left Sicily to deal with pressing matters in Catalonia. That absence opened a door to renewed unrest. Still bitter over their loss of influence, openly plotted against the crown, Arteli Alagona returned from exile, retaking strongholds in eastern Sicily and urging towns to reject royal decrees. Maria summoned what little authority remained. She called for loyalty from bishops, guilds, and coastal cities. Some answered, most did not, and yet she persisted. In Palermo, Maria oversaw the minting of new coins bearing her image. She signed letters personally. She appeared at court alone, a silent reminder that the throne was hers by blood, not marriage. Chroniclers from the period, both Sicilian and Aragonese, noted her presence as dignified but sorrowful. They never accused her of weakness, only of being in a battle that was never hers to win. And it wasn't just politics that isolated her. The very foundation of her power, her body, had become both a battlefield and a liability. A marriage, to Martin, remained childless. For over a decade, they tried to conceive an heir who might unite the bloodlines of Trinacria and Aragon. Each passing year deepened the anxiety. And in a world where a queen's worth was often measured by the womb, Maria's silence became deafening. The island whispered. Some said she had been cursed. Others claimed divine punishment for the forced marriage. A few even believed she had secretly borne children and lost them to illness or court intrigue. None of these stories were true, but all of them reflected a truth deeper than any rumor, that Maria's role was never to rule, only to birth, to embody, to justify. She had done all three. Still, it wasn't enough. By 1395, Martin returned to Sicily, this time with a hardened stance. The rebellion was no longer tolerated. Arteli Alagona was declared a traitor and hunted down with unrelenting cruelty. The Chiaramontes were executed or imprisoned. Entire towns were razed for harboring dissent. The island, weary from decades of infighting, began to bend under the weight of Aragonese order. But Maria, she faded. Her name disappeared from joint decrees. Her role in court affairs lessened. Martin, now secure in his rule, saw little use for ceremonial gestures. He had become the true king of Sicily, not by force of marriage, but by force of arms. Maria was relegated to a queen consort in all but title, quietly aging within the halls of Palermo's royal palace. She died in 1401. No ceremony, no grand eulogy. Martin did not attend the funeral. She was buried in the cathedral of Catania, beside her father, the last vestige of her royal lineage. For a while, her name faded from popular memory, overtaken by wars, plagues, and the endless churn of dynastic succession, but the record remained. A woman whose body was guarded like a reliquary. Its crown was leveraged, but never secured. Its virginity once held back the armies of Europe, in whose marriage, when it came, dismantled the very cause for which she'd been imprisoned. Centuries later, historians would debate her role. Was Maria of Sicily a tragic figure or a quiet reformer? Did she ever truly rule, or was she simply ruled through? Or was she something else entirely? It's a symbol of what it meant to be a queen, when queenship meant nothing without heirs, armies, or men. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Maria's reign, that sometimes the crown is not worn, but carried, quietly, reluctantly, invisibly, by women whose stories are only remembered for the purity others imposed on them. Asterisk, you are in Kent, England. The year is 1525. The wind carries with it the scent of wet leaves and hearth smoke, while the bells of a convent ring softly in the early morning air. Hey, you walk past the stone walls of the St. Sepulchre's convent in Canterbury, a place mostly unknown to history, at least until one woman's voice echoed through its corridors and stirred all of England. Her name was Elizabeth Barton. She was not born noble, nor royal, nor even particularly educated. She was a servant girl, a maid in a Kentish household who entered religious service not out of piety, but because it was the one respectable path available to poor girls with no dowry. She cooked, cleaned, and scrubbed floors. She listened to sermons, repeated psalms, and served in silence. And then one day, she fell terribly ill. It began with fevers, then trances, then strange murmurings in her sleep. Fellow sisters thought it was a spiritual crisis or a brush with death. But then she began to speak aloud during these episodes, not babble or nonsense, but full, coherent words, warnings, prophecies, messages. At first, no one listened, but then the name of Jesus passed her lips in perfect Latin. Then she recited prayers she'd never been taught. Then she began to weep uncontrollably for the sins of others. The prioress called in local clergy, who witnessed the episodes with astonishment. Elizabeth, they said, had been chosen by God, a vessel, a holy woman of visions. But it was not just the content of her trances that captivated listeners. It was her body, her maiden purity, as they called it. She had never known a man, never left the convent, and bore no signs of corruption. Her virginity was not merely a status, it was a symbol. It meant she could not be lying, that God had chosen an untouched soul to speak truths to the kingdom. And so, word of her vision spread. Bishops came to test her. They asked about sin, about heaven, about the state of England's soul. She answered with soft speech and trembling fingers, but her words carried weight. She warned of damnation, of suffering, of monarchs led astray. Her visions, she claimed, were not metaphor or poetry. They were direct revelations. And though many dismissed her at first, others began to whisper, "What if she speaks the truth?" It was enough to make the king nervous. At that time, Henry VIII was still married to Catherine of Aragon. He had no male heir. He had fallen for Boleyn. And he had begun the long, legal, and theological campaign to annul his marriage. A campaign that would append the religious order of England forever. And Elizabeth Barton, she stood in its way, not by design, not with power, but simply by speaking. She declared, in trance and in sermon, that the king's desire to divorce Catherine and wed Anne was sinful, that he was defying God, that his soul and England's was in peril. Said that if he married Anne, he would die a villain's death. She said it in public, and the people listened. It wasn't just the message, it was the messenger. Barton was seen as a pure vessel, uneducated, unmarried, unswayed by politics, a virgin nun who claimed no ambition, and that made her dangerous, because what she said couldn't be dismissed as political opposition. had the scent of prophecy. Asterisk. Soon, Barton was escorted from the convent and into courts, bishoprics, and eventually London itself. She met with powerful churchmen. Thomas More praised her, and Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, believed in her visions. For a time, she was hailed as a holy woman, the Nun of Kent. She did not ask for money. She did not claim titles. She simply repeated what she said God had told her, that the king's soul was in peril, that the divorce would bring ruin, that the people must resist. She never raised a sword, but her words carried more weight than steel. The king's advisors, of course, were horrified. Thomas Cromwell, rising in Henry's court, saw Barton as a threat to royal authority. Anne Boleyn, who had been the target of Barton's most venomous warnings, wanted her silenced. And Henry himself, a man who had once fancied himself a defender of the faith, could not bear the thought of a virgin, none undermining his divine right. And so the campaign to discredit her began. They sent spies to listen to her sermons. They collected evidence, or what passed for it. They examined her confessions. They said she had been manipulated by priests, that her visions were fake, that she was a fraud cloaked in virgin cloth. And yet her body betrayed none of their claims. No evidence of carnal corruption, no secret marriage, no lover in the shadows, just a young woman with no formal education, pale and trembling, still proclaiming visions of judgment from her God. The court did not know what to do in a world where religion and monarchy were intertwined. To arrest Barton was to imply that God could be imprisoned, but to ignore her was to risk revolt, and the people, especially the poor and devout, loved her. They knelt when she walked past. They kept her words in prayer books. They spoke of her as a saint in waiting. But politics does not bend easily to purity, and prophecy does not win against power. By 1533, Elizabeth Barton's time was running out. Henry had secretly married Anne Boleyn. The break with Rome was becoming irreversible, and Barton's continued prophecies were now not just inconvenient, they were treason. Her arrest came quietly. She was taken from her lodgings, brought to the Tower of London, and kept in relative silence. But her virginity, once her shield, could no longer protect her. The very thing that gave her authority was now reframed as naive delusion. She was no longer a prophet, they said, but a pawn, used by anti-king conspirators, bit lines by clerics. Dangerous, not because she was holy, but because she was simple. Her voice had been useful once, now it had to disappear. But before that disappearance could happen, she would be paraded before England, a trial of sorts. A confession, written or coerced, a public moment that would tell the people she was not divine, she was not pure, she was not right. And yet, even as the sentence drew near, many still believed. They whispered prayers, they doubted the charges, they remembered her soft voice, her trembling hands, her refusal to take money or power. She had asked only to be heard, and what she said still lingered in the minds of many. What if she had been right? Asterisk. You are still in England, but the light has changed. It is 1533, and the sun falls differently on the land. England is no longer the England it was, not just in politics, but in spirit. The Pope in Rome no longer rules the souls of Englishmen. The Church of England now bows to a new master, Henry VIII. And that shift, enormous as it was, did not come peacefully. It came with the silence of convent bells that no longer rang. It came with the arrests of abbots, bishops, and humble priests. It came with the shaking of ancient pillars, and at the center of this collapse stood a woman few could explain and many feared to name, Elizabeth Barton. To some, she was still the Holy Maid of Kent. To others, a deluded nun with dangerous friends. But now, to the crown, she had become a threat requiring elimination, not only of her body, but of her memory. Her fall would not be a simple execution. It would be an undoing, a public peeling, away of her image, layer by layer, till what was left was no longer recognizable. And so they began with her voice. They published confessions, long, carefully worded statements, signed with her name, statements claiming that her visions were faked, that she had lied to manipulate public faith, that she had been a tool in the hands of traitorous priests. But those who knew Barton well, or had witnessed her in trance, quietly doubted these claims. After all, how could a girl with no Latin training recite complex scripture? How could she, barely literate, debate theology with bishops? How could someone invent so many detailed prophecies, only to then beg for forgiveness once the king disapproved? And yet, this was the script the state required. Her purity, once her greatest defense, now became the target. They whispered that she had consorted with men, that she had lied about her virginity, that her body, once deemed sacred, was now simply deceitful flesh. But even these rumors lacked evidence. There was no scandalous lover to produce, no tryst uncovered, no secret child. And so the campaign turned toward association. Barton alone could not bring down the king, but Barton linked to the wrong men. Now that could be treason, and that is where the true trial began, not in court, but in narrative. The state moved swiftly to cast Barton, not as a saint or a fraud, but as a puppet, manipulated by traitorous minds. The names began to pile up. John Fisher, the principled bishop who had stood against a divorce. Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, scholar, beloved by Rome. A handful of monks, friars, and clergy who had once supported her sermons or allowed her to speak in their churches. None of these men had conspired to overthrow the king. Their crime was not violence, it was doubt and the public expression of it. And Elizabeth Barton's name, once spoken with awe, now served as a tool to frame them all in October 1533. Barton was forced, likely under duress, to participate in a humiliating procession. She was taken through the streets of London, dressed not in religious robes, but in plain, drab clothing. She was displayed as a liar, a deceiver of the people, a false prophet. Crowds gathered to watch, not to celebrate, but to understand. They had seen her sermons, they had believed in her words. They had carried her image in prayer. Hannah, now they were told she was a criminal. What changed? Had they been fooled? Or was this something more troubling, that the truth had become treason? Barton did not resist during her walk through London. She bowed her head. She did not speak. But in the silence, there remained a kind of power. Those who watched her pass recalled her earlier warnings that the king would die in sin, that an Bullen's rise would bring ruin, that England's break with Rome would unleash spiritual disaster. And even as Barton was displayed like a common criminal, something uncomfortable stirred among the people. Because if she had been so dangerous, why was there no blood on her hands? Where were her soldiers? Her conspiracies? Had she not simply spoken? The government, sensing this hesitation, accelerated her end. In April 1534, a bill of attainder, essentially a condemnation without trial, was passed against her in Parliament. It declared her guilty of treason, along with 5 of her supposed accomplices. She was sentenced to death, not for theft or murder or even rebellion, but for speaking words the king did not like. The sentence was clear: execution by hanging. Her virginity, her visions, her silence, none of it would save her now. But even as the date approached, some within the church still held fast. The Pope in Rome quietly declared that those who executed Barton would be excommunicated, that her claims, however inconvenient, might yet be true. But England no longer answered to Rome, and the king, now head of the Church of England, had made his decision. On April 20th, 1534, Elizabeth Barton was led to the gallows at Tyburn. The crowd was large. Some came to mock, others came to pray. Some came to see if a miracle might occur, a lightning bolt, a voice from heaven. a divine sign, but none came. There was no flash of judgment, just silence. A silence so loud, many remembered it years later. She spoke before her death, not to claim innocence, not to beg for life, but to ask forgiveness for misleading others. It was unclear whether the words were her own or dictated. Her tone, some said, was flat. Others recalled that her lips trembled. But once the noose was around her neck, no more questions could be asked. Elizabeth Barton was hanged. Her body, once revered, then scorned, was cut down and buried in a pit. No tomb, no marker, no memorial. The king was safe. Anne Boleyn was queen. England was reformed. And yet, the memory of Barton lingered, because what she had said, that the marriage would bring ruin, that the king would die in disgrace, was not entirely false. Less than 2 years later, Anne Boleyn would be executed by Henry's own hand. Within a decade, the monasteries would be dissolved. Thomas More and John Fisher would be martyred, and Henry, he would marry 4 more times, grow bloated and paranoid, excommunicated, and spiritually estranged from the very faith he once defended. So then, the question remained, had Elizabeth Barton been a liar, or had she simply spoken truths that power could not tolerate?